Hello there and welcome back to The Closet Historian and back to my sewing room for another pattern drafting demonstration. I've had a few requests to show how tulip sleeves are done. These little overlapped sleeves, often seen very short as like a cap sleeve, but also seen longer, especially in the late 30s and into the early 40s. You see this design pop up in both like mid-century designs and later in the eras when there was retro revivals going on in the late 70s and into the 80s, of course. It's one of those sleeve styles that's pretty common. You see it throughout the 20th century, so it's a good one to cover even though I had never tried them before. I will be showing how to do the smooth sleeve capped and the puff sleeve capped version of this sleeve today. Let's go ahead and jump on over to the blue patterning table of doom and get started. And here I'm starting with my long sleeve, my standard sleeve that you've seen me draft here on the channel. I can put a card up to that video here. And I'm just going to trace the top of that because of course we're making a shorter sleeve today. We don't need the whole thing. And I'm going to make these about 2 inches long. I will be referencing the instructions on how to make tulip sleeves here from Helen Joseph Armstrong in the book Pattern Making for Fashion Design. So that's what I'm referencing here and looking at off camera. So hers say to come in a 1/2 inch at the underarm seam there, so that's what I've done. You can see that. And then 3.5 inches out from the center. And I've just drawn a curve, across the sleeve here. This is the back side of the sleeve, which is kind of the top when it comes to tulip sleeves. You can make either the back or the front on the top, honestly, and you can also do more layers than just 2 if you want to. But you do need to do the same thing again for the other side of the sleeve, so I've traced that again, and I'm just copying this. The reason you can't just use that same other piece twice is because the front of your sleeve cap and the back of your sleeve cap may be different lengths, or different shapes exactly, depending on what your armhole shape is, depending on what your body shape is. So it's important to do the front and the back separately like this because they may not be identical. So this gets layered up like so, and you could do these in different colors if you so desire, different fabrics, different sheerness levels, or you could do it out of the same fabric. And if you're going to do the same fabric, you might as well just layer this up at the underarm here. So I've drawn in my seam allowance here for the underarm seam, and I'm just layering that closed, and then I'll just clean this up a little bit because it's a bit messy. And we can see I've gotten too carried away with my curvy floops down here, so let's just straighten this off because it'll make sewing this a lot easier. And who is going to be looking at your underarm that closely to see if it's extra swoopy? Nobody. Tape down my floops here, and now I have my basic little cap sleeve, tulip sleeve pattern here. Looks like this if you put an arm in it. That's right, you can have the overlap again on the back or the front if you want. But in general, this is your little tulip sleeve. We'll just trim that a little bit so it's a little bit more curvy. You can refine the shape as much as you'd like. And remember, this is, imagining this has seam allowance in it, so it's going to be a little bit shorter in the end, because my patterns all have seam allowance included already. But let's go ahead and do the puff sleeved version, which is extremely similar, you will notice. So again, I'm just going to make this, I think I made it 2.5 inches long this time, maybe 3 inches, I can't remember. But again, I'm just drawing in that little swoopy swoop, doing the back first. This is the back, this is the front of my sleeve. And I will cut that out. You can notice I've forgotten to do the 1/2 inch narrowing at this underarm seam, so I'll do that in a second. So here I'm going to mark my center because I've lost it when cutting it out. And if you wanted to, you could puff both sides, or the under layer and the over layer of this sleeve, but just for like smoothness sake and saving on fabric, I suppose, usually I think only the top layer is puffed. But of course, if you puffed both layers, it would be extra puffy, I should think. I'm just drawing some lines here so that I can separate the sleeve out. I don't remember what the recommendations are. I just have these kind of randomly spaced, honestly. But I'm just going to cut down every 2 inches from the center, and then an additional 1 inch on this side, just because I'm just flaring this thing. We're not doing it very, officially. Add a little bit of flair to your sleeve cap. This is not rocket science, I promise. You're going to come up about a 1/2 inch from the center and just round this off like so. Do you want me to make a video all about adding puff to sleeves? That's the question. Round this off, and now we have a puffed version of the back of the tulip sleeve. Let me go ahead and trace a copy from my first one that I did of the front of the tulip sleeve, because I'll just use a copy from the first one. Again, you'll see what this looks like. It's fine. You can be very official and meticulous about this kind of thing, or you can be me. I'm not afraid of playing around with this kind of stuff, especially when I'm making mock-ups like this, because if something goes wrong, I will learn even more, Go ahead and just draw in my seam allowance here on this one again so that I can, again, layer this like so. But once again, if you wanted to cut out like the top of a sheer and the underlayer of something opaque or black and white or whatever you're doing, you could color block this as well. But if you wanted to make it out of the same fabric, might as well make it into one piece like this. So now I have my plain one and the puffed version, or the smooth capped version and the puffed version, I can cut those both out of muslin. So I have, you know, a left and a right here, but I'm actually going to use these to just line one sleeve and make one of each here. So you can hem these any way you want. If you wanted to just keep it like this, you could hem it with bias tape. You could hem, I mean, it's a curvy hem, so it's kind of annoying to just turn it twice, but you could do like a micro little hem on this. You could hem it with bias. You could hem it any way you should like, honestly, by hand, by machine. But I am going to just fully line this sleeve. And again, it would be fun to line these in a different color so that it kind of peeks out sometimes, you know? But let me just mark on here where my underarm seam and where the centers are on each side, by the way, as I go around. And I'm just going to pin the hems of these so that I can line my sleeves here. Make sure I mark where I need to gather in between all on this cap as well. Then over here on the machine, I'm just going to use 1/2 inch seam allowance and hem these buddies by sewing 2 layers together. Of course, either side of the muslin looks the same, but you would want right sides together if you were lining your sleeves here. I'm self-lining them with their same fabric, which just provides such a clean finish that I think if I were to use tulip sleeves, I would want to fully line them like this. Unless it was going to be too bulky for some reason. But you can find some quite thin lining fabrics, so it should be alright. Same for both of those. Take these over onto the ironing board and I'm going to clip these curves. And I'm going to clip triangles out of them so that they lay nice and smooth for me and aren't too, again, bulky. And when you turn these right side out, you could also put some understitching in on these as well, if you wanted to. I mean, you could do top stitching too if you wanted to. You could do decorative embroidery. You can do whatever you want. This is just the basic tulip sleeve. Get creative with it, you know? You don't necessarily have to do this standard kind of shape of hem either. You could make them scalloped. You could do all kinds of stuff, especially if you're going to line them. You could make them scalloped a lot easier because hemming a scallop is not very fun, but lining it, not so bad. This is going to get overlapped like this. I'm matching up the center of my sleeve here at the top of the cap where the shoulder seam will be. And here's a little sleeve. We have one down, that's the smooth cap version. I'm going to clip the curves of this second version as well, and then we can iron it into place, and then I will put in my gathering stitching. Again, if you wanted to overlap it the other way, you could. It's up to you. But over here I'm going to throw in 2 lines of gathering stitching. I'm just doing that within the seam allowance, using the largest stitch length on my machine, which is 6 stitches per inch. And I'm just going to put 2 lines of stitching real close together. I'm using the presser foot as a guide to do this second line of stitching along the first. Parallel lines of gathering stitching always give the best results in my experience. So I'm going to grab those top threads, scooch this gathering down until this sleeve basically fits on top of the other one, honestly, like so. And then I can layer this buddy up to create my little sleeve here, and then I can set these into a bodice. I do have a bodice muslin from the Princess Seam video that I will be putting these in today. Just overlapping this, lining up the center mark again at where the shoulder seam will be, or where it will match up with the shoulder seam once it gets set into the bodice. And this does allow a little bit of flexibility, because if you are pinning from the I always start here, by the way, at the underarm, from the side seam of the bodice and the underarm seam of the sleeve. I pin there first and I work my way up to the top and hope that everything fits. But if for some reason you were having a little bit of trouble making these fit in, you could just adjust the overlap at the top a little bit and really no one would know. As long as it's just a little. So it's kind of forgiving in that way. But just set these in here into this bodice, working my way around, making sure that everything fits in nicely. Repinning when I have to repin. I had to move my gathers just a little bit because they were bunching up unevenly on me. I just adjust those, no problem. Keep pinning around the arm side here, and then I can set in the other sleeve on the other side. But this is going to look like this. Fun. I can do this other one. This other one I do have overlapped, quote-unquote, backwards, because it's the same. So I have this front over back at the shoulder, but again, it doesn't matter. If you want the overlap in the front or the back, it's up to you. It only really matters if you're doing the puff sleeve version and one is puffed and one is not. So you don't want to put the puffs inside the smooth, if that makes any sense. Try and keep track of what you're doing. That is one of the skills of the pattern drafter. When you're working without a pattern, without instructions, you do kind of have to keep things straight, but just work slowly until you've been doing this for like 15 years like I have. And then you'll get really mad when you make a mistake because it becomes rare enough that it's unusual and therefore extra annoying. But I used to make a ton of mistakes in sewing, so if that's still you, don't feel bad. You know, I've just been doing it for a very, very long time at this point. I have made it my vocation after all. I went to school for this kind of stuff. I've done it a lot. Anyway, I'm just going to trim my errant threads here now that I have my sleeves set in. Here's what the puffed one looks like. Again, just pulling out my gathering threads if I have to, making sure everything's puffed properly. I have my tailor's ham here. I'm going to press this so that the seam allowance is in the interior of the sleeve. I always press the seam allowance into the puff like this to help keep the puff puffed, if that makes any sense. And depending on how you finish that seam on the inside, normally I would just serge it, of course, if it were me. And here are my little tulip sleeves. So here's the smooth version, and here is the puffed version here, like so, what those look like. Rather fun. I do think that the 1/2 inch of narrowing on these really short versions is almost a little bit too much. You can see it starts to bunch a little bit around my arm. I think I would keep this like the standard width, I guess, as opposed to narrowing it that 1/2 inch like the book recommends, but in general these are serviceable and would totally work, but are a little bit short and cap sleeve like for me. I personally don't really like cap sleeves, which I know sounds odd seeing as I use the all-in-one sleeve a lot, and people seem to think those are the same, but not to me. But let's go ahead and make a longer version of this because I think I'll like it better. So I'm going to make a 6-inch long version, and I will narrow it, but on the 6 inches, a 1/2 inch becomes nearly nothing, you know? So it makes more sense to me on the longer version. But let's go ahead and again, just draw a curve in, 3.5 inches past the center, like so. You could use a French curve ruler for this kind of thing, or just eyeball it like I do. You know, get the ruler down off the wall next to me. That's a lot of effort. Just eyeball it, it's fine. Sketching it in with marker, of course, because while you should be using pencils for drafting, because I'm doing it for camera, I want it to be visible and use marker. So here's my back sleeve, set that aside. And then I can go ahead and do the front. I am going to go ahead and just trace the curve from that first one onto here, so I have a very similar curve. And I will make this a puff version again. 6 inches long, come in that 1/2 inch, like so. 3.5 inches out from the center, like so. Using that first one as a guide, so I have a similar curve. Just tracing that, connecting it down where I need to. And I will cut out this as well. This is the front side. And I will overlap these again at the underarm as well. This longer version is often what you see more in like late 30s dresses and like early 40s things. Seems to be longer. Earlier in the 40s. Let's go ahead and just puff this a little bit. I'm going to come out 1 inch from the center line here on either side is all, and do a little bit of puff. Again, I need to raise the sleeve cap a little bit as well as widen it. So putting in these wedges of fullness, about, I don't know, maybe adding like 3 inches of fullness in here at the top of the cap. Not a ton of puff. You could add more puff if you wanted to. Really widen this out. It's up to you how puffy you want your sleeves to be, and how thick your fabric is, you know, will limit that as well. If you have a very thick fabric, putting in a ton of gathers is probably not going to work very well, but if you have a thin fabric, go for it. Let me tape down my floops again. Now that we've added our puff in, and again, I will draw my seam allowance in at the underarm seam so I can overlap this buddy down there. And we have another tulip sleeve. This one's a little bit longer. And I just want to mark my centers on here because I've lost them a little bit. Let me grab my pattern so I can mark the center of my sleeve on here. Just hold that up and mark it again. All right, so let me cut this one out of muslin as well so you can see what this looks like. Same set of operations as for the shorter ones. This one's just a little bit longer, you know? So again, I'm just going to hem this with itself and set this into a muslin. But here's what that one looks like. But here's this one with a little bit of puff here. I think this is one I would be more likely to use this longer version here. I don't know, I like it a little bit better. So those are some tulip sleeves, actually a little bit easier to draft than I had first figured for, and very forgiving in the sense that if they didn't line up exactly, you would never know because of the asymmetry of it all. So it's actually more of a forgiving sleeve style, especially the puff sleeve version, than maybe the standard sleeve even is. If you have any other specific style details or drafting demonstrations you would like to see from me, please feel free to leave me suggestions in the comments below. And as always, thank you for watching today. I'll be back here with more sewing, vintage fashion, costuming, and crafting real soon, so I'll see you then. Bye.